Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're basically becoming detectives. We're going to piece together a series of clues from a really ancient text and see what or who emerges when we put it all together. So let's dive right in. So here's the big question we're wrestling with. Is it even possible to take a bunch of different prophecies written hundreds of years apart and have them paint a single, coherent picture of one person? It's like trying to solve a puzzle where the pieces are scattered across centuries. And where are we getting these puzzle pieces? Well, our main source today is the Old Testament book of Zechariah. Now, this was written to the people of Israel right after they came back from exile. They're trying to rebuild their nation, their temple, everything. And this book is just packed with visions and prophecies about their future, including these incredible descriptions of a coming Messiah. We're going to pull them out, one by one. Okay, let's start at the beginning. Part 1, the royal arrival. These first few portraits, they set the stage. They establish a powerful sense of identity, of authority, and this real hope that someone incredibly important is on the way. And our very first piece of the puzzle comes from Zechariah chapter 3, verse 8. The text introduces this figure, and it calls him the branch. Listen how it's phrased. I am going to bring my servant, the branch. Now that name, the branch, isn't just some random poetic term. It's packed with meaning. Its theme is that of a Davidic servant. And that's a huge clue because it connects this figure directly to the royal family line of King David, which is exactly where Israel expected their promised ultimate king to come from. So right off the bat, the very first brushstroke paints a picture of royalty. Okay, let's add the next piece and see how this picture develops. In chapter 6, verses 12 and 13, we get this really unique description of a king-priest. The prophecy says, he will be a priest on his throne, and there will be harmony between the two. Now, you've got to understand, this was a radical idea. In ancient Israel, the king and the priest were two totally separate jobs. It was their version of separation of powers, but this prophecy fuses them into one person, which suggests a kind of authority nobody had ever seen before. And then, just when you think you have a handle on this king, chapter 9, verse 9, adds this whole other layer of complexity. We meet the humble king. This is one of the most famous passages. See, your king comes to you, righteous and victorious, lowly and riding on a donkey. Think about that. A king who is victorious and also lowly? He doesn't show up on a massive war horse, he arrives on a simple donkey. What an incredible paradox. But just as this amazing picture of a humble yet powerful king starts to come into focus, the narrative takes a sudden, really dark turn. Welcome to part 2, the shepherd betrayed. The tone just completely shifts here from celebration to suffering. Just listen to the biting sarcasm in chapter 11, verses 12 and 13. This figure is now described as a rejected shepherd. He says, "So they paid me 30 pieces of silver," and then he adds, "the handsome price at which they valued me." You can just feel the pain and the irony in those words. And the absolute core of this passage is that specific price, the betrayal for 30 pieces of silver. This isn't some vague idea of rejection. No, Zechariah gives us a chillingly precise detail. 30 pieces of silver. In the ancient law, that was the compensation price for a slave who had been gored by an ox. It's a detail that just hangs in the air, loaded with insult and foreshadowing. And the suffering doesn't stop with just betrayal. In chapter 13, verse 7, we get this portrait of the struck shepherd. The prophecy is just so stark. Strike the shepherd, and the sheep will be scattered. This is a picture of a leader being violently taken down, which causes all of his followers to just abandon him and scatter in fear. Okay, so we've seen this humble king arrive only to be brutally rejected as a shepherd. Which leads to the biggest question of all, right? Why? What is this all for? Part 3 of our explainer is all about finding the ultimate purpose behind all this suffering. The absolute peak of this suffering narrative comes in chapter 12, verse 10. And here we get the portrait of the pierced one. The language is so personal, so tragic. They will look on me, the one they have pierced, and they will mourn for him. From being betrayed to being struck, and now to being pierced? So it all comes down to this. Why? Why this intense, graphic focus on suffering and death for a figure who was introduced to us as a king? What could possibly be the point of all this pain? And incredibly, Zechariah gives us the answer just a few verses later. Chapter 13, verse 1, gives us our next piece of the puzzle,
the fountain for sin. The text says, "On that day a fountain will be opened to cleanse them from sin and impurity." And there it is. The purpose is revealed. The suffering wasn't meaningless. It was for something. It was meant to bring about cleansing, forgiveness, atonement.
But this story doesn't end in a fountain of forgiveness. Not by a long shot. After the arrival, the rejection, and the redemptive purpose, Zechariah paints one last absolutely triumphant picture. Part 4, the conquering king's return. Our final portrait is of the returning king. In chapter 14, we read, "On that day his feet will stand on the Mount of Olives. The Lord will be king over the whole earth." Now just compare that to the humble king on a donkey. This is a totally different image. This is about a final, powerful, undeniable victory over the entire world.
So let's just step back for a second and look at the whole picture we've put together, piece by piece, all from Zechariah. We started with the branch, then the king priest, the humble king, the rejected shepherd, the struck shepherd, the pierced one, the fountain for sin, and finally the returning king. It's a single, complex, and totally coherent story arc from beginning to end.
Which really just leaves us with one final thought to chew on. We've just assembled this incredibly detailed portrait from a text that's over 2,000 years old. So the big question to take away with you is this. How does this ancient, complex portrait of a figure who is both a humble servant and a conquering king, who is both rejected and redeeming, how does that resonate with us today?